Okay, so here we mapped a URL, right, to retrieve a static list of users. And instead, what we want to be able to do is access this list of users from a database. That's the whole point, right? We want to expose the data that is stored in the database and make it available as a web service endpoint. So if we notice that what our data model is way down here, is inside of test, right? And test, what it's doing is that it's requiring the DB and then loading the model and then accessing it over here, all right? So we'll need to do something similar. So to do that, first we need to replicate this of instantiating and connecting to a database. We'll do that from the server, meaning when the server loads, right? It's gonna go. Let's see, where is it? It's gonna go into data. Then it's gonna go into DB. There it is. It's gonna instantiate it. So this is DB. All right, and then it's gonna do DB and instantiate the DB object. That's gonna connect to a database. Right. Once it's connected to a database, what we want to do is that in the service, in the user service, we already guarantee that we're connected to a database, right? By the time we get here, right? What we need to do is get a hold of what? Of the user model, right? Because the user model is the one that has all those nifty functions that allow you to retrieve all users and whatnot. All right. So let's do that. Let's get a hold of that. Let's do a var user model. It's in the it's going to be require in the, I think it's the we're going to have to go up one to down to data, down to models, down to user model. There it is. Okay, so yeah, it's not in the user directory, but it's right here. That's the one we're loading, right? Once we have the user model, we don't need this hard-coded users, right? We don't need this hard-coded users. Instead, what we can do is just use the user model. We can say user model dot find all users. This is going to retrieve all the users as a promise. Here's the then, right? That's going to retrieve that. It's going to receive the callback, right? Here, I think it's okay to have an anonymous function. It's a function that I'm not going to use anywhere, right? There's no point in giving it a name. And here's the response, which presumably is the array of all users. Okay. So what do I do with that users? I'm just going to send it back as a response from the server. We say response that's sent back the response as JSON, because I know these are already users. And let's restart this. So now if I go to users /API/user and refresh, notice that indeed we have the query from the data back here in the as a web service, right? So we have successfully made available our very prized private information of users. I guess if Facebook can do it, we can too. All right, so what we'd like to be able to do is that instead of exposing all the users, perhaps we can expose them one at a time and all their friends. So we can provide an API that says, hey, if you give me a particular ID of a particular user, I can then retrieve that one user. Okay. So for instance, we could do we can provide API/user/ID, right, or user ID, right, and then find. We'll call this find user by ID, and implement it way down here. So function find user by ID request. We would be tempted to write here user ID, right, but it's not, right? Remember, this function, all these functions are sitting in between two layers. These functions are sitting between the stream world of the HTTP request and the JavaScript world, right? So they're sitting right in between, and their only function is to map these two worlds. Okay, So typically there would be no logic here, right? There would be no logic, right? It's dumb. It just parses the request, right? And it just passes it along, right, to somebody who's actually going to do the work, right? All right, so here's the request and response. We're going to retrieve the ID of the user. So this will be request.params. Params. Now params is a map. Params contains all the path parameters in the path. Okay. You can use the square bracket syntax, right, and provide the property, the entry in the map, which would be user ID. You could do that, or something really cool in JavaScript is that you can use just the dot notation. Okay, the dot notation, it just treats it as if it were a property in an object. Okay, right. So once we have the ID, we can again use the user model and find user by ID, pass the ID, and presumably this will come back with a function with the user, and we're just going to respond with a JSON user. All right, so let's restart. So if we know the ID, we can just now provide a slash and then the ID, and it returns that one person. Okay, make sense? All right, awesome. What about if I want to search by other means? Maybe I want to search by username, right? Notice that this one, the slash here, only allows me to add an ID, right? And as the API, as REST proposes, right? It's just entity slash ID slash entity slash ID slash entity, right? That allows it to navigate the entire data set, but primary key at a time, one primary key at a time. Make sense? Right? But it doesn't allow you to filter other ways. What about if I want to query it by username, for instance? Right? You might think that, well, I should be able to just say Ada here. So user, and the user whose username is Ada, I should be able to do that. This won't work. Notice that I think I crashed the server. Okay, no, it's still looking for that. It's trying to cast it. It's trying to cast it to a primary key, and it's failing. All right, so it's kind of waiting forever to do that. Anyway, instead, what we want to be able to do is filter by other means. For instance, maybe I want users who have were born between a certain date range, or maybe I want employees that have make a particular salary. I want to filter, right? So to do that, we also have the REST stipulates that if you want to do that, what you want to do is instead use query strings, right? Where the query string will provide you with parameters that you want to filter by, right? So for instance, you might filter by minimum salary to maximum salary. So those would be two parameters that you would pass as part of the query, right? Which would be applied to the entire collection, right? Because you're saying, I want to look at all the collection, right? I only want a subset of the entire collection, only the ones that meet a particular criteria. Make sense? Right? So what we're going to do is that we're going to expand on this, right, on this user here. And instead of find all users, we want to be able to see if there are any filters. Okay? Let's see if there are any filters. So for instance, one of the filters might be, I want a user whose username is, right? Or whose date of birth is after or before, or things like that. Okay, so let's try it with just usernames because did I restart? Because I don't have. Well, I guess we could do type, right? Type equals student, right? We could do that, or faculty, right? Return 1. All right, let's use type. That's more interesting. Let's do that. So let's see. We can say we can retrieve var type. Unfortunately, you cannot do this. Question mark type equal type. you would think that says, well, I'll put the parameters as part of the path, right, as a URL, and then I'll just parse it out and I'll grab it from that variable. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Query parameters are ignored, right, when you're mapping the URLs, right? So anything that you put after this is just ignored. Instead, it's being passed to you as part of the request object. Just like you can retrieve params, right? You can also retrieve query parameters, right? Everything after the question mark is referred to as the query, right? Anything in the path is referred to as a path parameter, right? Everything after the question mark is a query parameter. All right, so let's retrieve request.query, and then again, I want to parse out the type. Okay. All right, great. If I have a type, if indeed there's a type, right? If there is a type, then I'll do something. If there is no type, I'll just do what I was normally going to do anyway. Okay. So the else will be my default. I'll just return all of them. But if I do have a type, I'm going to do instead something like user model dot find user by type. We never implemented that in the user model. Let's implement it. So I'm going to pass a type, and then it's going to do the same thing, right? It's going to just return. I'm going to respond with the type. All right, so we don't have type. Let's implement it. Let's go into the find all users, and let's add here in our user model. We'll say user model dot find by type, and there it is. And let's implement it up here. So function find by type, and here's a type. Notice that our data model, right? It's almost like the DAOs we implemented in Java, right? And the whole intent is that the data model is it doesn't really care where the query comes from, right? If it's coming from an HTTP request, if it was coming from the command line, if it's embedded in some query inside of the server, right? And that's how it should be. But the data model has absolutely no idea that this request is coming from an HTTP request, and it shouldn't. The data model should be self-contained, right? It should be able to you can use it from anywhere, right? So again, good practice, right? To that each module that you create is self-contained, right? It has as minimum dependencies as possible. So anyway, so here we're going to say return user model dot find and where type is equal to type. Okay. All right. So let's try it out. Let's restart. Let's come back here. So here's all the users. But if I say query type equal faculty, it dies. What? Did I misspell something? Oh. Okay, let's try that again. There it is. There's my faculty. Or if I want student. Right, it filters and gives me those two students. Make sense? Right, again, it's RESTful. It's still RESTful. And any filters or criteria by which I want to reduce my query would be implemented. It will be implemented as a query. And again, this is regardless of whether the middle tier is Node.js, right? We will soon now replace this with JAX-RS, JAX-WS, that's Java's web service API. It'll be exactly the same API, right? From the point of view of the browser, it doesn't really care, right? As long as on the other end, somebody knows how to parse this URL and map to them executable function. Make sense? All right, let's keep going.